welcome to everyone who's joining so far. I see the numbers are ticking up on the bottom of the screen. We're going to give everyone just a couple more minutes before we get started. So grab a mug of tea or a glass of water. And I think we're planning to get started at 7:05. I see lots of people still trickling in, so I'm just going to repeat that one more time. Say welcome again to everyone who's joined in the last minute or so. We're planning to get started at 7:05, so just give us one more moment, let everybody sign on, get settled in. See, there are folks who are joining. Before we get started, just a quick note about our format. If you haven't done a Zoom webinar before, we do have some folks on the back end who are going to be helping with the Q&A, taking down every question that comes in. We probably won't get to answer all of them tonight, but we'll do our best. If you have any questions throughout, there's a little nice Q&A box at the bottom, and we have staff on the back end who will help sort you out if you're having any issues. We're just going to get started in about 30 seconds. Right, it looks like it's 7:05. So for the third time, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. If you don't know, my name is Selena Gray. I'm the president of Death with Dignity, and I am in New York tonight, in Brooklyn. I am so excited to get to moderate this briefing, this post-election supporter briefing, and to introduce Peg Sandeen, Dr. Peg Sandeen. Most of you don't need an introduction to Peg, but for those of you who do, I will say Peg has been a leader of this organization in our movement for 17 years. She's the reason that I'm here, and I'm sure many of you are. Peg has, I think, a very unique combination of skills and experience coming into this moment and this movement. She's a former social worker who spent the early days of her career caring for people who are dying, and also a former lobbyist who knows the ins and outs of advocating for new legislation, state legislation, federal protections. I think there is no one better to talk me through this moment tonight, no one better to talk you through this moment tonight. And I am going to hand it over to Peg in just a moment to introduce herself, welcome you all. But if there was a way for me to do this warmly and ask you all to clap, I would say clap, cheer, raise your mug, whatever that looks like. Let's just enjoy this moment together after a crazy election season. Thank you, Peg.
Thank you, Selena, for that introduction and that welcome. And again, I know that Selena said this before, but I hope you have your tea and enjoy this pretty informal conversation about the election, what it means for the Death with Dignity movement. And really, I am just grateful that you are here. When I was thinking about putting together this briefing about elections, I really remembered back to how I got my passion for election day. And when I was young, I lived in Iowa, I was little, and my grandmother was this dedicated poll worker. She would volunteer at every election. And from the time I was in about kindergarten until that I was a teenager and I sort of refused to go for a couple of years, I would go with my grandmother on election day. We lived in a really small town. We would check people in, make sure they were registered to vote. We would give them their ballot, those short little pencils, and they will fill in their ballot. And I started on my grandmother's lap, and then I would sit next to her, and I eventually became a poll worker myself. And the thing is that what was special about that is then we would come home after election night and watch the results and talk about the results. And I think since that time, kind of like election evening and the week after and assessing elections, it's just built into my DNA. So I thank my grandmother for that time. And I hope that I bring my enthusiasm for elections to you tonight during this conversation. So when I kind of like look at the national scope, what I come to understand at this is that this election helped us answer a lot of questions we have about the future of the Death with Dignity movement, but it didn't answer all the questions. But the good thing is I'm not disheartened by what happened in the election or that some of the things are still up in the air, because I think the election results provided us with a great path forward, a solid direction for the Death with Dignity movement to aim. So again, nationally, I'll go nationally first, and then I'll talk about some statewide races that are really important. Nationally, control over the House and the Senate, as we all know, still remains up in the air and is likely to for the next month. We won't know who controls the House and the Senate anytime soon. But that really doesn't matter in my mind to issues of importance to the Death with Dignity movement. There truly are three pieces of legislation that Congress could address on our issue: two good, one bad. So the number one issue, the number one bill that Congress could take up is a bill to make Death with Dignity the law of the land, to make it legal in every state. The second bill, which is also a positive bill, relates to access. Congress could act to repeal a 20-year-old ban on using federal dollars to pay for Death with Dignity related medications, to pay for the MAID process. And that would tremendously smooth access, especially for people who use Medicaid or Medicare to pay for their healthcare costs. The third thing that Congress could do is the worst case scenario. Congress could actually take up a piece of legislation to repeal Death with Dignity and say it is unlawful all across the country. And the 10 jurisdictions that have Death with Dignity, it would go away almost overnight. The good news is, and somewhat the challenging news too, is that Congress is not going to take up any of those three pieces of legislation. And why do I say that? I think that, one of the reasons why Congress is not likely to have any path forward for us is the incredible levels of partisanship that exist in Congress. So thinking back to those days when I was a kid, sitting on my grandmother's lap, checking people into the ballot box to vote, Congress was really made up of the Democrats on one side, the Republicans on the other, and an entire smattering of folks in the middle. There were moderate Republicans, conservative Democrats, libertarians, all in the middle there. And that doesn't exist anymore. Fast forward to today, we have two parties, two pillars in Congress, and there is a ton of space between them. There are not people between them. There are not moderates between them. We just have these two highly partisan political parties. And what is the impact of that? The impact of that is congressional productivity has collapsed, just absolutely collapsed. Looking back 75 years ago, Congress passed year on year, each session, about 1,000 bills each year. Fast forward today, over those 75 years, we see almost a straight line ski slope drop in the number of bills Congress passes. And now we're down to a very low 300 bills a year that Congress does. And the question for me is what are those issues that get left off the table? What are those issues, that 700 number, that are not getting addressed? And the reality is those issues that Congress is either refusing to act on or unable to act on are the issues that complicate our lives today. They're the messy issues. They're the issues that are difficult to resolve. And unfortunately, issues about how we die can become messy. It is a very difficult process. And so in terms of the heap of bills that don't get addressed, that go untalked about in Congress, kind of death with dignity really sits right on them. And not only death with dignity, but issues about dying, issues about nursing homes, payment for long-term care, how we make sure that folks who are very ill have good care at the end of their lives. All of those issues go untouched by Congress. And so that extreme partisanship is really blocking up our ability to do anything nationally on death with dignity. The good news is that we do have a pathway at the states, and we are focusing as a death with dignity movement on expanding death with dignity state by state and protecting it where it's legal. And I want to talk about some of the key states for 2023. But before I do that, I really want to talk about the roles that are important as I analyze an election and as I analyze state by state. What are the roles that are really important? I look at governor roles and I look at leadership roles and committee roles. So governor roles are really important because a governor has the ability to sign a bill into a law or to veto it. You do all the work to get the bill through the legislative process and the governor says no, and then you're back to square one. And also the governor has the ability to use their political agency, their political capital to move a bill forward. And so it's an incredibly important role. In the history of the Death with Dignity movement, we really have only seen one governor stand up and use death with dignity and talk about death with dignity during a political campaign. And that was 10 years ago in Vermont. And that was Peter Shumlin who did that. So we're really looking in the future to thinking about death with dignity governors who will stand up and support us. Other roles that I'm interested in evaluating as I evaluate elections is those leadership roles. Who's the president of the Senate? Who's the majority leader in the House? Who is the Speaker of the House? Who's the Senate minority leader? Who are the committee chairs? Those folks make decisions about the tone and tenor of the types of bills that get passed in the state legislature. When you look at the pathways, when you just look at which bills get enacted and how the process works, it doesn't really say anything about the Speaker of the House or the majority leader. So these are the quiet levels of power that control the types of bills that move forward. They control which bills get a hearing. They control which bills get killed in committee. They control which bills kind of move forward or are going to be discussed. And so that's the reason why I'm going to talk about those types of roles in the states that are important to us. So first and foremost, the highlight, I think, of this election season for Death with Dignity happened in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where we now have a new governor, Maura Healey, who has come out as a supporter of Death with Dignity. We have been working since 2012 in Massachusetts and some of you were there with me. I was in Massachusetts that night. It was a very difficult night. But what I would say is now we have a clearer path forward. We have been working hard in the state legislature to make Death with Dignity happen since that 2012, and we are moving forward today, and we now have a very supportive governor in the state of Massachusetts, and I am very excited about that. Looking forward to New York, what I see is somewhat of a different situation, but also in a very important situation for the Death with Dignity movement. New York is a flagship campaign for us, along with Massachusetts. And so evaluating what happened in the New York legislature was important for me and important for us tonight. Overall, the body politic in Albany, right? That's where the center of government in the state of New York is. It's remaining the same. It is relatively unchanged, with Democrats retaining significant majorities in the Assembly, in the Senate. They control all the statewide offices that are of major importance to us, which would be the governor, the attorney general's office, the controller's office. So the only true question remaining in the New York legislature is whether there'll be a supermajority there. And I was just looking right before this conversation, and there's still a lot of elections that are a lot of individual races that are being resolved, some because there's a difference of only like 200 votes. And so they're counting those. So I don't have definitive answers for you today, but for the most part, we are status quo in New York. It's very similar to prior years, with one exception, and that will be the committee chairs in the Assembly. There was a combination of primary losses earlier in the year, retirements, and some general election losses, some surprises. And that means there's going to be a new chair for a lot of committees in the House and in the Assembly. And we're particularly interested in that Health Committee. And who ends up as the chair could impact movement of the bill. We who are working in New York is sort of talking like, we want this person to be the committee chair and we want this person. And the reality is we don't make those decisions. The New York legislature will make those decisions. They'll make those decisions after they go in session in January. So we won't really know the answer to who gets those important chairmanships for a couple more months. But I have to say, looking at the elections in November, in New York, I'm very pleased with the outcome, and I think that we still see a very good path to enactment of Death with Dignity in New York in the near future. Other states that I'm interested in, sort of flipping around the country or across the country to my side of the country. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, but if Arizona is another state of interest for the Death with Dignity movement. It's a state where we have been working very hard for several years now. And I just want to give a shout out to our partners, Arizona End of Life Options, which is just a tremendously smart group of folks. I have seen their campaign plan. It is clear, it is succinct. It is a plan that is achievable. It is a plan toward winning. And so I just have to say that the folks on the ground in Arizona have been working very hard to make Death with Dignity happen. One of the challenges that they have faced in the past is that the chairs of the health committees and the chairs of the committees that address Death with Dignity have been very anti-Death with Dignity. They have been against medical aid in dying. And that has made it really hard to even get started in Arizona. And what we're looking at now is, unfortunately, Arizona is one of those states that is a toss-up. We don't know the results of many of the races, either federally or at the state level. And so we'll have to wait and see how those chairmanships go, whether or not we have a supportive or not supportive chairmanship. Also, the governor's race is in a similar position. It is a race that is up in the air. We are not sure what's going to happen. It's a very tight race. And we have, what's interesting about that governor's race is we have a very pro-MAID candidate and a very anti-MAID candidate. And so really depending on the outcome of those races, depends on how much progress we will see in Arizona next year. But again, I think that there is a plan in place, and the organizers on the ground have done what they need to do. They've put everything in place that if the state opens up politically because of the elections, they are absolutely ready to push death with dignity and get it a great head start in the legislature. In Nevada, we see a sort of a similar problem with the many of the races are a toss-up, probably a little less rosy than I want Nevada to be. I happen to have taken a very strong interest in Nevada. I've been there many times. I very much want Nevada to enact a death with dignity law. I worked with an advocate there whose name was Debbie Black, who worked for a couple of sessions. She was very, very ill, and she worked very hard, and she died before Nevada granted her the right to a death with dignity. And so I am saying that Nevada is going to be a hard push next year, but the reality is that in Debbie's name, we are going to push as hard as we can to make death with dignity move forward in the Nevada legislature. The last state, and this is another pet state of mine, so I'm just going to throw it in, is Minnesota. Minnesota had a blue wave for the first time in about 20 years. So we see Democratic governors, Democratic Senate, a democratically controlled House. The reality is death with dignity, we're not a straight up progressive issue. We actually run with a coalition of progressives, of moderate Republicans, of libertarians. And so a blue wave in Minnesota doesn't guarantee death with dignity. It just has a pathway to the governor. But the reality is it irons out some of the wrinkles, and it makes sure that death with dignity can inch just a little bit further. And being a child of the Midwest, I have always, in my 17 years here, wanted a death with dignity state from the upper Midwest, and I think Minnesota is going to be it. So sort of to wrap up, without a path to the law at the national level, states remain the most important actors, right? They are the actors for our issue. And right now, every state that you live in can legislate to protect our right to die with dignity. There's no reason for a state not to do it. And what we need to do, we need to get creative. We need to take risks. We need to get past these unsupportive legislators that have stopped us up for so many years. And we need to push governors. We are starting to have governors step up to our issue, and we need to continue to push hard on the top seat in a state to achieve death with dignity. And the final thing that we need to do, politics, everything about politics has gone out the window these days. So we need to break the rules of engagement. We don't need to play nice, because that's how progress is won. That's how progress for people with terminal illnesses is won. So in that vein, what can you do to support death with dignity, the death with dignity movement, in light of this election outcome? Of course, one of the things that you can do is make a donation to Death with Dignity. Our movement fights against entrenched institutional operatives who have very deep pockets and who sit in the halls of power in our country. Here at Death with Dignity, we operate on slim margins, so we can always use your generous donations to advocate for the rights of people who are terminally ill. Another way to help us is to share your story. We don't talk about death much in the US, and we like to pretend it doesn't happen, but everyone on this call tonight knows that's not true. Our stories change people's minds. They're the most powerful tool in the fight that we have for death with dignity, in the fight for the rights of people who are terminally ill. And like many of you, I have a story of someone I love who died badly and who desperately wanted death with dignity in the state of Iowa, and it was not available there. It was banned. I know it's an act of courage to share his story. It is an act of defiance in the face of power that wants to avoid hard conversations, that power that wants me to be quiet. But I hope that you will join me in telling your family story and my family story so that we can act to smash the death taboo in the United States. I think I'll end there. I feel like there's so many things that I could say. I'm seeing questions filter in, but so what I want to do is turn the mic back over to Selena, transition to answering your questions. So please, if I've said anything that makes you want clarification about, or you want to think about, please drop it into the question box. And Selena, I invite you back to transition to questions.
Thank you, Peg. Thank you so much. I want to jump out of my chair a little bit right now, but I'll just take the mic instead. So we're going to have a good amount of time for Q&A, and we want to take this time to answer questions that came in advance, to hear what's on your mind a couple of days after the election, and now that we've started talking about this. So just as a reminder, the best way to ask a question is to throw it into the Q&A, and we've got folks on our team that are reading those questions. State-specific questions, we are probably going to take a note of and get back to folks, because there will be so many and they will be so specific. We really want to make sure that we're answering everybody, but please take a moment if you have a question and throw it into the chat. Just to get things started, one question that has come up a couple of times before this conversation and during this conversation, Peg, elections aside, so this is sort of a fun one to start with, how concerned should we be about lawsuits and court challenges that might upend laws or stop the progress of death with dignity?
I think that is a really good question, and is probably the number one question that's been on my mind, especially since the Dobbs decision repealed Roe v. Wade, is whether or not we have a risk at the courts. And I'm going to talk specifically about the Supreme Court, but there are also some state court issues that, parsing state court issues is more difficult. So I do think at the Supreme Court, we face a pretty big challenge, and that is unfortunate. And so I hope that death with dignity doesn't end up in front of this court. I will say that one of the reasons why I say that is we have one justice in particular, Justice Gorsuch, who has written a book about death with dignity and against death with dignity. So if we look at who Justice Gorsuch is he has a history on the federal bench, and he's a rule of law judge. What that means is when he makes issues a rulings on any decision, he looks at the history of the law and makes his ruling based on that. The challenge is, if you read his book about death with dignity, it is not a rule of law book. It's a book about morals. It's a book about his personal values, although he doesn't call them that. It's technically a book that it feels like it's written by the Catholic Church, to be honest. And so the challenge with Gorsuch is you would assume as a justice that he would rule on our issue from a rule of law perspective, if you look at his past. And that rule of law perspective is that medicine is, the states govern the practice of medicine. But the reality is he's not going to do that. He's already written about this. He is going to come at this issue, this particular issue, from a morals position, and he's going to take a strong leadership role. And I think for a number of reasons, what the court is doing today on issues of bodily autonomy, which we are part of, and also Gorsuch's leadership and thought about our issue, is I think that we have a risk at the court. The good news is, I sort of fumbled this question at the beginning related to state courts, is our opponents don't have a great pathway to the Supreme Court. The way the Death with Dignity Act is written, it's really hard for them to get there. They've not succeeded in getting there before. And so because that pathway for them is blocked, I'm somewhat confident that our issue is not going to be impacted by the courts.
Thank you, Peg. I know that was a hard one to start with, so
thank
you for letting us throw it your way. To pivot in a little bit of a different direction, it has come up now a few times in the various chats that I'm looking at, this much more straightforward question to some extent, which is, where is the best place to share your story if you want to advocate in this movement?
There's a lot of places that you can share your story. And I believe that we dropped into the chat a share your story invitation, or a place on our website where you can share your story with us. And so please use that link to do that. Other ways that you can share your story is that you could write a letter to the editor that is about your story. I had a letter to the editor published in the New York Times that was just really short. It was about, like 5 lines, but it was my story. I spoke my piece in the New York Times, sharing my story. Other places that you can share your story is with your legislator. So you have a new elected official, someone who just won their election. Figure out when they're going to be in town. They have town halls, they have parties, they have other places. So meet with your legislator, tell them your story. They represent you, and I think that they will listen to you.
I want to ask a related question that just popped up that Alaya shared with me, which is for folks who are new to talking to lawmakers, legislators about this issue, but also in general, do you have any tips to break through? How do you approach a conversation like that?
I have so much to say about this, and I would say it's partly because my history of being an Iowan. And in Iowa, one of the things is that we have a very open process, and legislators, you just get very comfortable with going to a political party and there's a legislator there and telling them your story. If they're speaking at the library, they'll listen to you. And I think that we have this kind of like this wall that we build up, like these are people in power, and this is we're just these little people. And the reality is the people who represent us are just everyday people. They're teachers, they're social workers, they're physicians, they're lawyers, and they have lives too, and they have families too. So I think that you should feel empowered to speak to your legislator and tell them your story, because they represent us. That's their goal. That's their job. And we should hold them accountable for doing their jobs. And part of their jobs is listening to our stories.
Well said. The breadth of the questions that are coming through, I think, really reflects the fact that this is a 50-state issue. So, Peg, thank you for letting us pop around a little bit. This is me asking for forgiveness for moving around a lot on you. But the next question that popped up, there's actually been 2 questions about residency requirements. So let me kind of cram this into a 2-parter for you. I think the first is can you explain what is being debated about residency requirements and new laws? And sort of a part 2 is how should folks in this issue, in this space, really think about think about lawsuits that are challenging residency requirements. Where do those stand? What's sort of a high level take? And I feel like that's a huge question. So please take that in the direction you see.
Yeah. So what happened in Oregon is that there was a court challenge to residency requirements. And rather than the court actually coming to a decision, what they did is they brokered a deal. So they brokered a deal that asked the Oregon legislature to make a change to Oregon's residency requirements next legislative session. But the Oregon Health Authority in the meantime has said that they're not enforcing residency requirements right now. So technically we'll see the bill in January, but residency requirements in the state of Oregon are not being enforced right now. I'll take the new bill question. What's interesting about this residency requirement is I have taken this to a couple of legislators in states that are considering death with dignity, that are sort of on the table. They haven't enacted it yet. And those legislative sponsors, their initial reaction has been like, nope, we want a residency requirement. And so it's a challenge to sort of pedal backwards and understand that that is acting as a barrier to access. And we really want to get to a point where states don't have residency requirements. We will get there, but I will tell you from being on the front lines that it's a legislator's initial reaction to say we want one. So that's going to be a challenge. You're not going to see it immediately go away. What I do think that we'll see is I've heard that other states are considering removing residency requirements, which I am so excited about. I've heard murmurs about Vermont. I've heard, sort of rumors about New Jersey. One of the challenges, though, of course, is there are very few providers in some states. So if New Jersey happened to repeal its residency requirement and folks from New York can go there, or folks from Pennsylvania could go there, the challenge is there's not a ton of providers. So I do think that it's a good thing. I'm very happy that these residency requirements have been repealed or starting to be repealed. I think the challenge of access is going to remain, unfortunately, and then it behooves us as a movement to engage more doctors to participate in the process. Did I get both parts?
I think so.
I think
so. I know there are a lot of state-specific residency questions coming up in the chat, and I just want to remind everybody that we are making a note of all the questions that come in. We are going to follow up after this. So if we don't get into specific details, rest assured, we really do want to dig in and make sure that everyone feels engaged. The next question that has come through is a very simple, why can't we just make death with dignity a national law?
I think I'll go back to what I said about Congress. Congress is stuck. Congress is non-productive. It is not taking up any controversial issues. It's only passing about 300 bills a year as compared to prior years when it would pass up to 1,000 bills in a year. So many issues that are complicated issues like ours just get left on the table. What's left on the child welfare legislation is left on the table. Legislation regulating immigration is left on the table and not discussed, even though our country desperately needs some guidance about that. And my second answer, I don't know if it's something about the zeitgeist in the United States these days, or sort of like the ethos, but when I look at some of the pieces of legislation related to death with dignity or other issues internationally, I feel like some parliaments, some national legislatures are really willing to wade into the complicated issues of modern life. Right. And in the United States, we've actually gone backwards on that. We really have started to have this binary approach. It's like this or that. It's white or black. It's life or death. It's war or peace. It's yes or no. And the binary approach doesn't work with most of these complicated issues in modern life. And Congress is just not taking them up. I mean, that they either have this yes, no answer, or they don't deal with it. And we are in that pile that there's not a yes, no answer to dying there, it's really complicated. And so Congress, non-productive Congress is just not going to take it up. But can I say one more thing? It won't always be that way. I mean, this is the thing that's really important to remember. Like, we kind of get stuck in this moment, like we'll always have the Congress that we have. But, in the 200-year history of the United States, Congress has taken up a lot of bills or few bills, has been partisan or nonpartisan. And so we will not always be stuck in this. And I think it behooves us to lay the foundation, to do all the work at the state level. So when it's time, when the national government opens up and sanity returns to our federal government, we are ready to act immediately.
That's well said. And, you're reminding me a little bit, there's a statistic somewhere about how many members of Congress actually started as state legislators. So I think that just speaks to the power of what you're talking about, starting at the state level and not giving up on the national. One of the questions that Alaya has just flagged for us is about outreach, knowing that at the state level, there can be a lot of different people to talk to. It can feel a little bit of an unknown. When thinking about lobbying or talking to a legislator, who do you talk to first, especially since I think, especially in states like mine, the legislature can be very large.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, the people to talk to are the people who represent you. sometimes, in fact, a legislator won't meet with someone who's not their constituent without a specific reason or without a lobbyist guiding you, some insider taking you through the halls to their office. So really, I think the place to start is your legislator themselves. And the reality is that can be in Albany, that can be in Salem, that can be in Olympia, it can be in Des Moines or wherever your state legislature resides, or it can be when your state legislator is at home in their office. They actually have an office in their district. So you don't have to necessarily go to the Capitol building. You can actually meet with your legislator in their home office. And also, if they kick the meeting to a staff person, sometimes that can be frustrating to you because you want to meet with your legislator. But the reality is, if you're in a big state like New York or Massachusetts with a big year-round legislature, those staff members are really important. They are very key. And so I think that if you are invited to instead speak to a staff member, you should embrace that, because that staff member tends to have the ear of the legislator. And so I don't think you should feel put off by that at all. That staff person can be an important ally.
A follow-up question just came through on this, which is, what's the right time to start advocating between now and let's say next year?
Well, I think it's any time. I mean, I just feel like there's always a time to tell your story. A couple of times that I would say this week, legislators are probably tired, so if you're enthused, unfortunately, probably this week is not the week to start. But legislators are going to be starting to think about what committee. They're going to be starting to think about like where my desk is if they're newly elected. All of those things, like when you start your new job, they have that same thing. I also think that sort of like week 2 and 3 and 4 of a legislative session are really good, because it's not the first week. So they're not like learning where the restroom is, or, where I hang my coat, or, what time I have to show up to work. But they have all of those logistics in place, but they're beginning to think about what's my calendar, what am I going to do? So that early on week. And then also our movement and most other issues that you're interested in have lobby days. And so those are just absolutely good days, because a whole bunch of people that are interested in our issue flood the Capitol. And so that's a good time to speak with your legislator also.
That's great. One of the harder questions that just came through is many folks are in states where there's organized opposition to death with dignity, or to bodily autonomy at all. How should folks think about advocating for this law when they know they're about to face opposition? Is it worth trying to convince people who oppose the law to support it? How do you approach that?
There's so many answers to that question, because the reality is that our opposition is national. So every state faces a national opposition. If we start death with dignity in a brand new state where it's never been introduced anymore, national opposition that is organized on our issue shows up. It is not local opponents, it is national, well-funded opponents. So this is just not a rare case. This is every case. Every state faces this. And this is really important for us to know, that opposition is national and organized. So that's our reality. That's our giving. That is the, assumption when you move forward. And so again, I think that you have to set that aside. And what you have to do is, again, hold your legislator accountable for listening to your story. And I guess that's what I would say. And I might answer the question a little bit differently by saying that one of the things that I do when I meet with a legislator is I actually have all of like 3 bullet points. I want to tell my story. I want to ask them to vote for my bill, and I want to explain some piece of the bill that they seem to not understand. But also I might have in the back of my head a couple of answers about what our opponents would say, so I might have just like buried in the back of my head our opponents say this, and then I have a response ready for that. I don't lead with what our opponents say, right? I don't tell their message. They can be responsible for sharing their story. But am I ready to counter it? Absolutely. So I have to think that opposition is a given, right? And so what we need to do is make sure that that we're ready to answer those questions.
That's great. That's super helpful. I think the opposition question is a hard one and probably on a lot of people's minds. And so to dig a little deeper, one of the related questions that has come up a couple of times, who are sort of the biggest national opponents to our issue? Is that worth reflecting on for a moment here and talking more about both being aware of that, and then relatedly, who are the people who should be supporting us and how do we bring them closer to us?
So I'm going to start with the opponents because I think this is really important. Our opponents is organized religion, and specifically the Catholic Church. They know that if they stand up, Catholic priests stand up and say, we oppose death with dignity for moral reasons, for our religious reasons, because of our religious teachings, they don't get support for that necessarily. They might get support for that among the people who are agree with that, but not, the rest of the country. So what they do is they use their money to put other faces of the opposition. And so what the Catholic Church has done is made the face of the opposition of the death with dignity movement, the disability justice movement, people with disabilities, and also some physicians. And they're losing the stronghold as physicians, as the face of the opponents, as more and more state medical societies move to a neutral position and say, this does work. It can work. It is okay for physicians to consider death with dignity. And so they're sort of left with the face of the disability justice movement as the opponents. But the reality is that the opponents are the Catholic Church. And I want us to share a story. I was just at an international conference, and I heard a story about something that happened in Newfoundland, Canada, when they first enacted their MAID legislation, and they were helping the first patient to access their MAID law there. That's medical aid in dying there. And that person was in a Catholic nursing home, living assisted facility. And they were getting ready to provide this patient with the medication. And the edict came down from Rome that if they allowed this to happen in their facility, they would shut down the entire nursing home and evict all the patients. Think about this. This is the church caring for people, and it's going to evict every person receiving care there because of our issue, because of one person receiving our issue. And so this is very serious. This is national, this is international, and this comes from the very top of the church, which has very deep pockets and is playing very hard in our political system. So that really is the opposition. That is the core of the opposition that we have to worry about. And you had a proponent question too. So if you could flip that to me again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you kind of answered it because you talked about more and more doctors coming out, medical societies with neutral positions. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
You bet. I mean, I think that, again, physicians, when I first started 17 years ago, physicians were really the face of the opposition, and somewhat a little bit still the church was willing to stand up and, be like a church-based opposition. We don't see that anymore. And gradually, the American Medical Association is still has an opposition statement, but mostly state medical societies are moving to neutral, and they're doing that in recognition that over 50% of their membership, over 50% of physicians are willing to be supportive of death with dignity. That doesn't mean they're all willing to be a prescriber, but willing to be supportive. And so they're recognizing that there's a split in medicine, that medicine is actually recognizing a role in addressing suffering at the end of life, in addressing what happens if someone has a protracted dying process, that they don't want to abandon patients who want death with dignity or deserve it or need it. And so I do think that medical society is moving on this. Medicine is moving. We have an official standard of care in the United States now. There's a way that it works, and physicians are increasingly understanding that. And I will say, especially new physicians graduating from medical school, physicians who've grown up in Oregon, who have had death with dignity in Oregon their entire lives, and understand that it's just part of medical practice. And because of that, that's the shift that we're seeing in medicine.
It's a really encouraging note, and I wanna land us on an encouraging note as we wrap up the Q&A. But I do have one other question that came through that I think is important, and I'm challenging you to bring it back to the same place, Peg. I know you can. So our last question, and I want to remind everybody that we are going to follow up. I know there have been many more questions than this. We really appreciate everybody taking the time to ask them. We are going to follow up and make sure we get you the answers. But the last one we want to share tonight is if someone is living in a state that isn't likely to pass death with dignity anytime too soon, what is the best way for them to advocate for death with dignity?
I really think one of the most important things is, and I'll go back to this, is sharing your story. And your story might be, I want this for myself. And that is an okay story. Like, that is the most important story. But sharing that story with your friends, with your family members, with your colleagues. Again, we have this death taboo in our country where we don't talk about dying. But I can tell you, the minute I open up and start talking about dying, or I share my husband's story about how he died badly, there are stories, multiple stories in the room that are similar to mine. And once that door opens, this is a safe space to talk about death, people start talking about death. And something happens, because we come to this conclusion that it doesn't have to be this way, and we can start to make progress. So I can certainly appreciate living in a state that doesn't necessarily share my values on one issue or another, but I think the place to start is talking about it. And once you get comfortable talking about to your friends and family, then it moves to legislators, then it moves to people that you go to church with, and it moves to people who are distant colleagues or something like that. But I think that we should never underestimate the power of ourselves in sharing our opinions and our thoughts with people who matter to us.
Peg, you just took very, very well, very, very articulately the final point that I was supposed to make before we wrap up, and I hand it to you to deliver any last thoughts. So I've been asked to reiterate our core asks tonight. So let me just do that, play my moderator role, and say, just to remind everybody that if you want to support our organization, if you want to support this movement, advocating in your state, advocating nationally, it's the most important thing to do. And I think Peg has laid that out better than I could. So I will leave that there. I will also just take this opportunity to thank everybody. I know everybody who has showed up tonight is a supporter of this organization, has been showing up on this issue, and we really appreciate that. And we're so glad to be working with you in the year ahead. Peg, do you have any last thoughts or anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up tonight?
I mean, I would just say thank you for you all for taking the time to join me tonight with your cup of tea and to think about death, right? And talk about death. It's not the easiest thing to do, but I would just say overall, this election, I'm not disheartened. I am pleased. There's a strong path forward. There's a path forward through the states. And as we build state by state, as we attempt to move it forward, whether the bill only gets to a hearing this year and only gets to the floor next year, what we are all doing is building to the point when Congress is ready to act on difficult issues, and we are one of those issues, and will have laid the foundation for success to make death with dignity the law of the land. And that's what I would say.
I love it. So in the chat now, hopefully everybody has a reminder of the links that we've been talking about, especially the share your story link. And I want to remind everybody who hasn't met our team that if you don't feel comfortable, responding directly to a form there to share your personal connection to this issue, you can always reach out to us over email. You can always respond to the communications we send. We do in fact read all the emails, and we're always happy to hear from you. Thanks to our team, who nobody can see right now, but is working really hard behind the scenes to capture all these questions, make notes, make sure that we're prepared, make sure that we follow up. We will be in touch very soon, and we hope everyone has a great evening.
Bye, everybody.